from 2014. A great man passed on this day, or, as some noted, died. His name is plastered around Australia in lots of locations, some unlikely. He was a little shallow in some ways, but he towered for his achievements for which the world should applaud. Some despise him, but that is probably mere partisan politics. He was above that. The great man was Horatio Nelson, and he died in 1805 at Trafalgar, off the Spanish coast near Cadiz. An old chardonnay socialist who also died this morning, Gough Whitlam. More about him later. To set the scene, in 1805, England's greatest sailor was facing near certain death and humiliation off the Spanish coast on the morning. He had a desperate plan that had never worked successfully before. He was faced with a larger force of a combined fleet of Spanish and French fleet under the command of Pierre-Charles Villeneuve for France and Federico Gravina for Spain. Nelson had 27 ships of the line to 33. Classically, the ships would form in two lines and shoot at each other with broadsides until the fleet with less guns and ships was annihilated or surrendered. But Napoleon had plans to march his grand army into Britain, and if Napoleon's fleet was free, her massive army would easily take London. So Nelson was faced with a battle he couldn't surrender or lose, but couldn't win through conventional means. So Nelson's plan addressed it by promoting the superiority of British ships to one-on-one combat. Britain had better ships thanks to her guns having triggers instead of lit wicks for firing, better trained men, and copper-lined bottoms for her ships. Nelson's desperate plan was to sail his ships directly towards the enemy line in two lines at a right angle. He knew the front two British ships would have to weather about 30 minutes of direct fire from the enemy line. But when they closed, he would be able to fight ship to ship with the center and vanguard of enemy ships, while the enemy ships in the top of the line would have to turn around and re-engage. Nelson had two lines because when the tact had been applied in the past, the concentrated fire on one ship had sunk it in every subsequent one. Two lines, he calculated, would diminish the damage taken to either. Nelson led one line, Cuthbert Collingwood another. Nelson wanted to tell his men he was confiding in them, and he knew they would do their best, but the flag signal man told him he could transmit the message more easily if he substituted a few words. The message, approved by Nelson, is recorded in history and stirring. Instead of Admiral Nelson, the word was England, and instead of confides, the word used was expects. The message had become, England expects every man will do their duty. In battle, the forecastle of Victory, Nelson's ship, had lines of marines. Some 6 were picked off before he gave instructions that they could break ranks and seek cover. Nelson's secretary was adjacent to him when a cannonball knocked his head in, splashing his brains onto Nelson, who remarked he didn't like the taste and regretted that the secretary would not experience victory. Nelson stood with full assignations on his uniform, including a stunning diamond. Smoke obscured the scene as Victory closed with Redoubtable, and a sniper shot from Redoutable's mast nest mortally wounded Nelson. Captain Hardy was on hand and carried Nelson below deck to see the surgeon. Hardy could have been charged with negligence for deserting his post later. Nelson took some 5 hours to die. Near death, Hardy returned to report success. Nelson thanked God he had done his duty. Britain had not lost a ship but captured 21 ships and destroyed another. Napoleon could march his grand army on Moscow later as a result. England would rule the waves around the world until World War II. I dispute that Gough was the worst prime minister at the time of his death. His abysmal foreign policy is still felt around the world, his debt crisis is still unbalancing the Australian economy, and his bad reform of the Australian Labor Party has kept it in the 19th century and prevented good people from achieving anything. But Rudd, then Gillard, were worse. It is worth listing Gough's achievements. Gough distrusted the United States, who were allies, and embraced communist China before Nixon went to negotiate freedoms. He ended conscription and pulled Australia out of the Vietnam sooner than High Command had planned. That meant that when the US pulled out in 75, that lots of weapons were left behind that were dangerous for the communist world to have. The threat that communist Vietnam would sell those weapons to Timor's communist rebels meant Gough gave the nod to Indonesia to invade to prevent those communist Timor rebels from buying and using those weapons. The Timor invasion by Indonesia resulted in the apparently planned deaths of Australian journalists at Balibo by Indonesian special forces, some of whom vie for Indonesian politics today. Gough distrusted southern Vietnamese who had been supported by the United States and spurned their pleas for help. Because of his disastrous spending, Gough needed lots of money and sought to embroil Australia with Iraq. Gough had become leader of a disunified, infighting ALP, and he took steps to reform it by aligning it more closely with unions and producing the model that cannot be reformed now without disentangling from corrupt union leadership. In Australia, Gough spent unsustainably and made reckless promises. He promised free education and made it harder for better students to study at university, ultimately making it more expensive for everyone. He promised fair access to health care, but delivered a faulty product that needed to be reformed. He politicized the High Court and Governor-General's position and created the Family Court, which even today is highly criticized for poor decision-making. Gough cared little for those he was responsible for and complained when his holidays were interrupted for disasters, like Cyclone Tracy and the Melbourne floods. Gough was the champion of empty symbolism and claimed to do things he hadn't done, like ending the White Australia policy. He divided Australia on racial lines by creating a body which has failed to address the needs of Aboriginals adequately. Gough felt betrayed by the Governor-General he appointed, and he ruined the man who served faithfully. John Kerr, Gough was patron to notable ALP figures in Keating, Gillard, and Clare. He was a charming man who could joke about his megalomania in a pasta advert. On the plus side, he got rid of McMahon as Liberal chief, but he ruined that with Fraser. World Series Baseball, Pixar versus Disney, Viz. San Francisco Giants versus Kansas City Royals. The rivalry is friendly and serious. U.S. politics is dominated by the presidential elections, which have primaries, which result in two opposed candidates. The process is pretty good in galvanizing support behind each candidate, and so too the World Series is an example where the main season is about demonstrating the superiority of each team that has their division. By the end of it, the best team of the season will have won 4 World Series baseball games against the next best. May the best team win. Terrorist Turkey allows Kurdish reinforcements after obstructing help from going to desperate Kurdish fighters. A 17-year-old Australian ran away from home and now preaches hate in favor of ISIS against Mr. Abbott, as he is now a terrorist. Maybe his school report cards could be released for the public to know what a terrorist spokesperson was like at school. AGW alarmism. Warmish should apologize to Barb Carter, who was slammed by AGW alarmist scientists rather than debated. A basic tenet of academia is that anyone can have a good idea, and that ideas can be robustly debated. Instead, Carter was smeared and his ideas not debated, but denied. That is still anti-intellectual, which is a character of most AGW alarmism. People suffer from green alarmism, a lot of poor people who get denied what others get because they can't afford it. Because of green policy, Greens might have good intentions. Freedom of speech. Barry Humphries defends Barry Spur, the Sydney University poet whose privacy was invaded by a left-wing magazine, who denied him natural justice for saying things the magazine did not agree with. Luckily, the NSA does not often behave like that. Celebrating on the ABC what diminishes women as a guest wears a high hijab to obscure her face and says she likes him. ABC spreads Peter Carey conspiracy theory that U.S. government dismissed Whitlam and not the Australian people. Universities embracing freedom. A few universities have stopped terrorists from advancing their noxious claims. Oscar Pistorius got 5 years maximum for killing his girlfriend on Valentine's Day. Oscar's success is not a great moment in freedom of speech, but the judge had determined it wasn't murder. So it must have been a personal expression of a person who struggled to say what he really meant. Local politics, ABC's too big, dwarfing commercial media. Labour leads in polls, which means little at the moment, but is a big threat unless addressed. $433,000 for each unemployed Aborigine placed in a job by $1.5 billion ALP policy. I could have done better. I could have done a better job for half of that.